Tuesday on Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Instagram Live. Today we are carrying on with our series about the truth about trauma. So this is part 3. So in our first 2 lessons, we went through and talked about some of the natural survival instincts that the human body creates in response to fear or trauma or abuse, and how that affects or creates kind of patterns that continue on through life, and then how those patterns actually have a profound impact on our brain, the biological chemical changes that occur in the brain that make it very, very difficult to let go of those patterns later on in life once they start to become problematic. So with all of that behind us, if you haven't seen them, you got to go back and check them out. We're not going to have time to jump into it again today because we're moving forward. Today is week 1 of talking about potential different interventions or potential different therapies that can be applied to help individuals who have experienced trauma in the past kind of reconcile and bring that to the present. And once they've got a better understanding of, and they're able to integrate that trauma into their present life, then hopefully they can move forward in the future events that were triggering to them no longer are, is the idea, obviously, because that's a lot of what we're talking about here, is the idea that once something's triggered you have this really strong emotional response that just really isn't a lot of times appropriate to the environment, to the situation. It can have really devastating effects if it leads to some type of self-harm down the road kind of thing. So how do we prevent that kind of feedback loop from continuing on and on and on again, and have the individual always being stuck in this habit of being triggered and having some kind of self-harming activity and then repeating again and again. And so on the surface, again, this makes a lot of sense, right? If you're humiliated or ashamed or afraid or abused, then our body naturally looks to protect itself, right? For self-protection. So a lot of times aggression or depression or arrogance or passivity, all these things are learned behaviors, right? They're things that we feel is necessary in the moment to survive whatever experience the individual experiences. The issue is that over time, when these habits repeat themselves, we begin to kind of deny or ignore or split off these parts and hide them away, because that's easier than trying to deal with the experience as it happened in the past and integrate that into our lives. We just kind of section this off and put it aside, and then that allows us to function more effectively in our day-to-day lives until we come up into that triggering event, and all of a sudden this area that we've sectioned off comes back, and we kind of flash out and have this big response that we didn't necessarily expect to have, or isn't really appropriate for the situation. And so that's what we're talking about with these traumatic responses. And so what we're talking about today is IFS, so Internal Family Systems, which is developed by a gentleman named Richard Schwartz. And the idea is that instead of considering these passing emotions as just strong responses that may or may not be appropriate for the situation, is to think of them is distinct mental systems with a history, ability, needs, and a worldview. And so when we give it that kind of character, if you will, kind of thing, so you're imagining that you have different parts of yourself, and this makes a lot of sense, I think, right? There's certain times of us that we're really joyful and playful. There's more times that we're more serious and focused. There's more times that we're quiet and reflective, and other times that we're outgoing and fun. It's easy to think that we kind of have different modes or different hats that we wear, right? And so the beauty of IFS is it identifies 3 different components that are essential for therapy or for recovering from traumatic experiences. And so the first one being the exile. And so this is the part of ourselves that are hurt the most from the traumatic event. So oftentimes these are the most loving, these are the most joyful sections of ourselves, and they carry the pain, the betrayal, the terror that came from that initial traumatic experience. And this is the one, remember we were talking about kind of denying or ignoring or splitting off. So instead of having to feel the shame or humiliation or betrayal or pain, whatever it is, that joyful, playful, loving section kind of just gets sectioned off and makes way for the manager. And so this is the function of the role of the manager, is to avoid making deep, meaningful connections, or in some other cases being relentlessly productive. So again, if you're busy and you have lots to do, then you don't necessarily have to deal with some of these emotions that are simmering under the surface. Or again, if you don't let anybody get too close to you, then obviously there's no way that they're going to be able to harm you in the future, kind of thing, because you haven't made that meaningful connection. So they're what people get kind of on a day-to-day basis, and that again is a survival mechanism. Just allows us to be productive and functional to an extent. Now, the last one that's worth talking about here is firefighters. So these are impulsive behaviors, often self-harming, and they are kind of activated or triggered whenever the exiled emotion or the exiled section of us is triggered by an event or an action. So again, that version of ourself that was hurt in some way at some point in the past from a traumatic event, maybe a child that was abused or somebody that was made fun of or bullied, whatever it may be. that an event occurs in the present that kind of triggers that same feeling of shame or humiliation or whatever, and all of a sudden the firefighter kicks in to kind of save the individual, and you can maybe get aggressive behavior, really passive and quiet behavior, whatever kind of kicks in place to kind of protect the individual, and then you get all kinds of different behaviors that occur that a lot of times are self-harming. And the problem or the issue can be that a lot of times these things are diagnosed as different conditions, right? We have different eating disorders, we have different mental health issues that are diagnosed, and so all of a sudden they're a problem. The beauty of IFS, why it seems to work so well, is that instead of making it a problem thing and continuing to push it aside and push it away and try and help the individual focus on areas that are more practical or more productive, is IFS encourages the individual to ask the manager or the firefighter to step aside, so you're able to get to the exiled portion, the part of the individual that's feeling that shame, that terror, that betrayal, and experience it and accept it, and treat it with compassion and curiosity instead of thinking of it as a problem that needs to go away. And you see really quickly how that becomes a very different thought. Instead of saying that, this reaction to me is just something that happens when I get triggered by this event because of something that happened in the past. I'm really not happy when it happens. I'm doing my best to kind of manage it and keep it under wraps and keep it kind of tucked away. No, like, it's signaling to us that there's an issue, there's something going on below the surface. So if we're able to get that firefighter or that manager to step aside and move aside, and we're able to be present with the exiled part of ourselves, that exiled emotional state, and then be curious and compassionate about how that part of us was feeling at the time, then a lot of times then we can bring kind of safety and trust to that part of ourselves, and kind of reconcile the feelings that we felt. Because a lot of times, especially if we're talking, it can be for adults as well, but obviously as a child, then there's a little bit more helplessness there. Or again, if it's a traumatic event that happened as an adult, likely you felt helpless, and that's why it was so traumatizing, because there's nothing you could do to kind of alleviate the suffering you're experiencing. And so to go back and comfort that part of ourselves and say, that there was nothing you can do, and it's okay to have felt ashamed or scared or fearful or whatever it is, then all of a sudden you can begin to integrate that back into yourself, and move forward in a more holistic and meaningful manner. We can kind of experience everything fully instead of always having to fear being triggered by that shame or that anxiety or whatever it is, and having the firefighters and managers kick in. We can just learn to accept it and bring it on board as part of ourselves. So hopefully that makes sense. I know I skimmed over a lot, and there's a few examples from the book that I could read, but I think we're going to keep it at just the explanation for today, because I do want to be respectful of your guys' time. So in short, instead of when we have these extreme or intense emotional or physical reactions, behavioral reactions to an event that triggers some of the emotions or feelings that were that originally occurred with the traumatic event, whether it's adulthood or childhood, whatever it may be. When those events are experienced, a lot of times then it leads to self-harming behaviors, and then those things can be diagnosed as some kind of medical condition, something that we need to treat with medication, or something that's never going to go away, that it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that will always happen. The idea of IFS is that there's managers, people that make you really productive or make you really distant, and then the firefighters that lead to impulsive, also often self-harming behaviors. One of those two will get in the way whenever an individual feels triggered, and that's kind of what keeps that cycle going. So if we can ask the manager, if we can ask the firefighter to step aside and be present with the exiled, or the part of ourselves that experiences that shame, that shame, that terror, that pain, then we can be a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more sympathetic to that part of ourselves, because we're able to comfort it and make it give it an opportunity to feel safe and secure. And so in this case, kind of create that shelter, that protection that wasn't available to us at the time of the event, integrate it into ourselves, and then from there able to kind of move forward and hope. And the idea is that through time and through talk and through reflection and kind of being present and compassionate to that section of ourselves that felt all that negative emotion at the time of the traumatic event, able to over time kind of accept it, that it did the best that it could in the time, kind of thing, integrate it back into ourselves, and then hopefully in the future not so triggering, or not such a strong response from the firefighters or the managers in the future. So there we go. IFS, again, something that maybe takes a second to wrap your head around, and for some people may feel a little bit, kind of like a trick or a semantic thing, right? Like if we're just changing it from, instead of being a problem to being a being that needs to be supported and cared for, does that really make such a big difference? Potentially it does, right? Potentially it does. And that's the beauty of this, is when we create the space to bring compassion and curiosity into our reflection, into our mindfulness, instead of just thinking, oh, it is problematic or something we got to ignore, instead of something we got to push down, but actually get closer to it and be more careful, more curious about examining it, a lot of times that idea of pushing it away versus bringing it into ourselves is really the biggest difference. And so not always possible depending on the severity of the trauma or what was experienced by the individual, but in a lot of cases it can be really productive and really helpful. So something to consider, even if you're doing just your own mindfulness practice kind of thing, thinking about when you have really strong emotional responses, if you felt angry, if you felt shame, if you felt fear today, like what kind of bubbled it up, and then what can you ask the firefighters, can you ask the managers to step aside, and what was that experience like, and go from there, see what you come up with. So that's it for this week. We're wrapping up here, and we'll see you guys back here same time, same place, 2:00 every Wednesday for part 4 next week of our 6-part series on the truth about trauma, and we'll be sharing with you another potential treatment intervention for helping individuals who've experienced trauma integrate that and move forward in a more productive manner going forward. So have a good week, everyone, and we'll see you back here next week. Take care.